This man is about to die, all because he was doing business on someone else's turf. After the local gang leader confirmed that Combo was the target, he didn't say a word. Seeing that they weren't sincere about buying the contraband, Combo flashed the gun at his waist. The thugs, sensing trouble, wisely decided to leave. Combo kept cursing under his breath. However, what he didn't expect was for the two men to circle back and stop at the corner, staring him down menacingly. Seeing the situation turn sour, Combo immediately made a call for backup. Just then a kid on a bike kept circling him.
Hey, what's that thing in your ear?
What did I say? Get out of here. What are you waiting for? Go.
After Combo shooed the kid away, the car across the street honked its horn a few times. Then Combo heard the sound of a bullet being loaded behind him. It turned out that the kid was the hitman they had sent, with several gunshots. Combo fell to the ground. This is what happens when you encroach on someone else's territory. Then the kid took off with the bike. Meanwhile, under Skyler's escort, Walter went to the hospital for a checkup. Del Cavalli suggested that Walter undergo a procedure to remove lung fluid, but the surgery would cost up to $200,000. He asked them to think it over before deciding. However, Walter unilaterally agreed without hesitation, which confused Skyler. Where would they get that much money? Del Cavalli suggested doing the surgery in 2 weeks, but Walter said it conflicted with his daughter's birth, so he postponed it by another 2 weeks. Back at school, Walter took out the cell phone hidden in the ceiling and saw dozens of missed calls from Jesse, so he hurriedly called back. Jesse said our man Combo was killed. However, Walter didn't know who Combo was exactly, which deeply disappointed Jesse, who then hung up the phone. Skinny also came to Jesse, intending to quit because the incident of Spudge getting his head crushed by an ATM had been exposed, and Jesse's persona had collapsed as a result. With no outlets to sell, the two sought help from Saul. Hearing that they had over 30 pounds of product, Saul was stunned. They were sitting on a gold mine. But what's the point? They've lost their way to cash in. Seeing that the two were clueless about business, Saul introduced them to a mysterious merchant who had been in the business for many years and had never failed. His cautious style was somewhat similar to Walter's. With no better ideas, the two decided to give it a try. Back at home, Jesse hadn't yet emerged from the shadow of Combo's death. He was very down and asked his girlfriend Jane to leave. Jane sensed his troubles and guessed that he was an illicit dealer. Jesse confessed to Jane that he needed some contraband to relax. He wanted Jane to leave for a while. Reluctantly, Jane prepared to leave, but as she opened the door, she hesitated. She decided to stay and join Jesse. Ironically, the courage hanging on the wall is the very thing they lacked. The scene shifted. Walter arrived at the chicken restaurant Saul had mentioned to meet the mysterious person, but he waited a long time without anyone coming to meet him. Half an hour later, Jesse staggered in, apparently having taken quite a bit. The two waited a long time but still saw no one. Just then, a waiter came over to greet them. They ignored him, not realizing that this person was the one they were looking for. Jesse, growing impatient, eventually left. Walter was also anxious to join his wife for a prenatal checkup, so he went to the hospital. Based on Skyler's examination, the doctor recommended a cesarean section the following Friday. After the checkup, Skyler said she needed to return to the company, because Ted, the boss of the company, is celebrating his birthday. How can Skyler miss such an important occasion? Ted asked Skyler to sing him a birthday song. At first, Skyler was a bit reserved, but after Ted's insistence and the employee's encouragement, she began her seductive performance.
Happy birthday, Mr. President of Beneke Fabricators Incorporated. Happy birthday to you.
Ted was completely captivated by Skyler's heartfelt performance. On the other hand, Walter was still on the phone complaining that the person Saul introduced him to hadn't shown up, but Saul's reply was that the person had been in the restaurant the whole time. Walter asked him to contact the person again, but Saul said that there were too many intermediaries, which made communication inefficient. Frustrated, Walter hung up the phone. Then he went back to the chicken restaurant to try his luck, so he waited from day until night, when most of the customers had already left. At that moment, Walter saw through the glass the waiter who had greeted him during the day, but his demeanor was clearly that of a successful businessman, not a waiter at all. Walter then realized that this man was the one he was looking for, so he quickly got up and approached him to strike up a conversation.
And 5 minutes of your time.
He was the owner of the chicken restaurant, known in the underworld as the Chicken Man. At first, Gus acted as if he knew nothing and suggested that Walter had mistaken him for someone else, but Walter's intuition was correct. He insisted that this man was the mysterious merchant, since Saul had mentioned that this person was very cautious, and this matched his own way of doing things. Walter asked Gus to give him another chance. In the next second, Gus's expression changed.
I don't think we're alike at all, Mr. White.
He pointed out the flaws in Walter's approach and the lack of punctuality of his partner. Even more fatally, Gus saw that Jesse was an addict, which proved that Walter's judgment was not up to the standard for cooperation with him. But Walter promised that the contraband he produced was the purest product currently on the market, which was his only bargaining chip in negotiations with Gus. After asking Walter how much product he had, Gus turned and walked away.
Will I hear from you? I have your numbers. You can never trust a drug addict.
Gus's presence completely overpowered Walter. On the other side, Jesse was still immersed in the sadness of Combo's death. To help him ease his grief, Jane brought Jesse an experience he had never had before. It seems that Jane is better at this than Jesse. Afterwards, Jesse was so excited he felt like flying. Meanwhile, Walter was proctoring a student exam at school when suddenly he heard the vibration of a cell phone. He reminded the students to turn off all their phones, but he still heard the sound. At that moment, the students discovered that the noise was coming from the ceiling. It turned out Walter's hidden phone was not turned off. Walter hastily explained that it was the sound of the pipes. After the students left, Walter saw that Gus had sent him a text message. He rushed into Gus's restaurant, but he couldn't find Gus anywhere. Just as Walter was about to leave, he was suddenly stopped by one of Gus's men.
1 hour.
What?
1 hour, you in or out?
In, absolutely, but I just need a little more time.
1 hour. If you miss it, don't ever show your face in here again.
There was only one chance. Walter quickly tried to contact Jesse, but no one answered Jesse's phone. It seemed Gus was right. Jesse really was unreliable. Walter couldn't worry about that now and drove straight to Jesse's place. Meanwhile, at work, Skyler suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach. It seemed the baby wanted to come into the world sooner than expected. Walter arrived at Jesse's house and knocked for a long time with no response. Just then, Skyler called, but at this critical moment in the deal, Walter chose to ignore it. He went to the backyard and knocked, but still no one responded. Out of options, he had to break in. When he sees Jesse unconscious, Walter pours water on his face.
Where'd you hide it? Where is it? Where's the product? Where is it? Where'd you hide the meth? Where is it? Where?
Under the sink.
While searching for the contraband, Skyler kept calling him, but Walter continued as if he hadn't heard. Finally finding it in the place Jesse mentioned, just as Walter was packing up his goods, Skyler texted. It turned out his daughter was about to be born. Walter first instinctively smiled. Then his face fell instantly. After a moment's thought, Walter decided to go through with the deal with Gus first. If you were Walter, what would you do? Walter rushed to the hospital in a hurry, but he still missed the birth of his daughter. However, Skyler wasn't angry about this because, at the critical moment of her labor, her boss Ted had driven her to the hospital in time. To avoid any awkwardness, Ted quickly left on his own. Walter apologized to his wife and asked if there was anything he needed to do. Since Skyler had come directly from work to the hospital without time to go home and get postpartum supplies, she asked Walter to go back home to get some things. This was exactly what Walter wanted because he planned to take the opportunity of the empty house to secretly hide the money he had earned. Meanwhile, Jesse and Jane were still immersed in their sweet slumber when suddenly a phone call from Donald woke Jane up. Because today was the day she was supposed to go to rehab, Jane hurriedly got up to leave but noticed that the door had been smashed in, clearly a sign of an intruder. A groggy Jesse looked up and immediately sensed trouble. He rushed to the kitchen and discovered that his contraband had been stolen. He immediately called Walter's house.
Come on, hurry up.
So you heard, huh? Yes. Good news. Oh, she's just so beautiful.
Junkie imbecile, what the hell are you calling this number for?
I am trying to tell you, man. Last night, somebody broke in my place, Joe. I got robbed.
What?
Yeah, somebody. They got all of our stuff. Okay? They knew exactly where to look.
Hearing what Jesse had to say, Walter hung up the phone in disbelief. At the same time, under her father's supervision, Jane arrived at the rehab center, where she seemed very nervous facing other people's stories. She kept twirling her 18-month sobriety token in her hands. She had stayed clean for so long, but unfortunately, Jane couldn't resist the temptation again, and her father was completely unaware. Afterward, they went to a restaurant where Donald, seeing Jane looking tired, asked if she hadn't rested well. Jane lied, saying she had been helping someone with a very complex tattoo. Donald didn't want Jane working in such an environment, as most of her clients were thugs and riffraff. He feared she might accidentally fall back into addiction. Donald suggested that she find a good job, to which Jane agreed perfunctorily. Then, Jane politely asked about her father's work at the airport control tower. Donald said it was the same as always, with training even on his days off. This hinted that Donald was too busy with work to pay much attention to Jane, because the last time Donald went to see Jane, he saw Jessie next door looking forward to Jane's introduction. Donald asked her if she was in love. Although Donald's intuition was right, Jane denied it outright. Without evidence, Donald couldn't press further. In the evening, the two families gathered together to celebrate the new baby, with Hank bringing fried chicken from Gus's place. Walter suggested buying a high-tech baby fence, but Skyler worried about the cost, especially since Walter had an expensive surgery coming up, and she planned to go back to work the next day. Walter suggested that Skyler spend more time with the child and that he would figure out the money situation. Although he had already earned millions in cash, he couldn't boast about it in front of his family. That night, when the baby was crying, Walter got up to take care of her. With his wife and son asleep, Walter took the opportunity to show off his earnings to his newborn daughter, giving him an unprecedented sense of satisfaction in front of his family. The next day, Jessie came straight to Walter's classroom after listening to the voicemail Walter had left him. He learned that Walter had already cashed in the product and demanded his share, but Walter didn't give Jessie the money right away because he knew that giving Jessie the money would only lead to his quicker demise. Jessie began to blatantly lie, claiming that he no longer touched those things. Walter simply threw him a cup, saying that if Jessie could pass a drug test, he would give him the money.
Well, I guess until then, you'll just have to depend on the kindness of strangers to get high. That and your little junkie girlfriend.
When Walter mentioned Jane, Jessie immediately became hostile. Seeing that he couldn't get the money, Jessie left dejectedly. From then on, the relationship between Walter and Jessie had a rift. Back home, in order to prevent his daughter from spitting up milk will choke Walter, also thoughtful for her rolled up towel under the body cushion. This detail also echoes the manner of Jane's eventual death. Just then, Skyler walked in and said their son had done something unbelievable. It turned out Walter Jr. had created a fundraising website, something Walter, with his immense pride, could not accept. Walter went to Saul and complained about having so much money he couldn't spend and couldn't let his family know about, making everyone think he was on the brink of bankruptcy. Walter told Saul about his son's fundraising website. Quick thinking, Saul suggested that they could hire a top hacker to funnel money into Walter Jr.'s account in small increments. Although this wouldn't show his own efforts, Walter had no better solution at the moment. On the other side, Jessie, having failed to get the money, started to let loose again, after learning that Walter owed Jessie $480,000. A sinister idea flashed through Jane's mind. The next day, Donald waited at the rehab center, but Jane did not show up. Little did he know, Jane and Jessie were still asleep. Upon receiving Donald's call, Jane knew something was terribly wrong, so she hurriedly got up and, in her panic, went straight out of Jessie's room. Unbeknownst to her, her father had already driven over. When Donald saw his daughter coming out of the next door, he was so angry that he broke the door down. And when he saw Jessie still awake and the tools on the table, Donald was so angry that he was going to kick Jessie out of the room. With the truth now revealed, Jane wanted to have a serious talk with her father, but at this moment, Donald was in no mood to listen to her explanations. Jane had maintained her sobriety for 18 months, but in the end, it all fell apart. Donald was extremely disappointed in his daughter. Jane's current state was deeply tied to her family situation. Left with no choice, Donald decided to call the police, but seeing his daughter's sincere pleas,
Okay, I'll go first thing tomorrow.
Not tomorrow, today.
I have to call into work. I have to stop the newspaper. Last time I went to rehab, all my houseplants died because you didn't water them, so please.
he ultimately softened. Little did he know that this decision would lead to lifelong regret, because Jane had her own plans. She wanted to help Jessie get the money back so they could run away together. To force Walter to hand over the money, Jane's tactics were right on the money.
You know what? I take that back. This is blackmail. Because what I know about you, high school teacher turned drug brother-in-law in the DEA, that'd make one hell of a story. National news, I'll bet. Do right by Jessie tonight, or I will burn you to the ground.
Hearing this, Walter almost spat blood. In order not to lose his reputation, Walter finally sent the money to Jesse. Jesse came over and couldn't even look Walter in the eye.
You'll never hear from either of us again.
You're not seeing straight, Jesse. You're making a mistake.
Walter wanted to give the misguided youth one last piece of advice, but Jane coldly shut him out. With the money in hand, Jesse and Jane fantasized about a life of freedom, deciding to start with rehab. However, upon seeing the last bit of their hidden contraband, they decided to indulge one last time before leaving. A depressed Walter went to a bar to drown his sorrows and coincidentally met Jane's equally troubled father. They don't know each other, but they're both in the same boat, and they talk about their kids. Here, Walter spoke only of Jesse, whom he had long considered as his own son. Walter asked Donald for advice on how to discipline children. Donald expressed his belief to never give up on family. It was this very phrase that made Walter turn back to Jesse's house. He didn't want to see Jesse continue to fall into decay, so he decided to have a serious talk with him. But when he knocked, there was no response. Looking through the back door, he saw they were already asleep. Walter still went in, intending to wake Jesse up. While calling out to Jesse, he accidentally turned Jane over, leading to her choking. Walter instinctively went over to save Jane, but he stopped when he got to her side because in his heart, Jane was nothing but trouble, and that's how Walter watched Jane choke to death. This further darkened Walter's character. Jesse woke up to find his girlfriend had turned into a cold, lifeless body. He tried to perform CPR on Jane, but she showed no response. Jesse broke down in inconsolable sobs. At the critical moment, he still called Walter, who pretended to know nothing and comforted the heartbroken Jesse. Little did Jesse know, Jane's death was directly related to Walter. Walter told Jesse to wait there for help, as he had already planned his next move. The scene shifts as a car pulls up in front of Jesse, and the person getting out is Mike, the cleaner sent by Saul on Walter's orders. To prevent Jesse from facing prison, Mike expertly cleaned up all the incriminating evidence at the scene. Before leaving, Mike instructed Jesse on how to deal with police interrogation. Seeing Jesse refusing to accept the harsh reality, Mike slapped him to wake him up.
I woke up, I found her, that's all I know. I woke up, I found her, that's all I know.
Again?
I woke up, I found her, that's all I know.
Then Mike continued to explain what was going to happen next and advised Jesse that if he was taken to the police station for questioning, he should say nothing and immediately contact his lawyer, Saul. This clearly showed that Mike was no ordinary man. Meanwhile, Donald still didn't know that his daughter had died. He had planned to go to rehab with her that day. Donald arrived at her doorstep only to realize something was wrong, and upon seeing his daughter's cold body, he fell silent. After cooperating with the investigation, he didn't lash out at Jesse but chose to leave quietly. At the same time, Walter Jr., who had created the fundraising website, was glued to his computer, watching the account balance rise and feeling an unprecedented sense of achievement. Skyler was also very pleased with her son's success. Little did they know, all this was Walter's orchestration behind the scenes. On the other side, Hank at the DEA also prepared a donation jar for Walter, and to show his appreciation, he brought over some of his homemade beer, because they found blue contraband on the deceased combo. Hank linked this to the Heisenberg case. After Hank's investigation, it was clear that Combo was just a low-level player who couldn't possibly produce something of such high purity. But here's the issue. Ever since Combo's death, the blue contraband had miraculously disappeared from the town. Additionally, the prisoner who previously stood in for Heisenberg had been exposed by Hank, who was certain that Heisenberg was still at large. Hank's dogged determination on the case hinted at an inevitable showdown with Walter in the future. Meanwhile, Walter was very worried about Jesse, so he used the phone hidden in the toilet tank to contact Jesse, but no one answered. Finally, with Saul's help, Walter found Jesse's hiding place. To numb himself, Jesse hid in a chaotic place. Walter couldn't bear to see Jesse continue to fall, so he took him to a high-end rehab center and advised Jesse to adjust as soon as possible. Jesse remembered a phrase Walter had said when they were trapped in the desert.
I deserve whatever happens.
At this point, Jesse was slowly accepting reality. Meanwhile, the DEA chief, George, was introducing their investors to Hank, and surprisingly, Gus was one of them. This proved that Gus had infiltrated deep into enemy territory for his business, showing his meticulous approach to operations. Seeing the donation jar Hank had set up for Walter, Gus learned about Walter's relationship with Hank and that Walter had been diagnosed with cancer. It seemed Gus's trip was not in vain, and he even casually donated some money to Walter. On Walter's side, He had just returned home when he saw TV station personnel. It turned out that Walter Jr.'s fundraising website had gone viral. Marie had even invited the television station for an interview, which made the supremely proud Walter very uncomfortable. Facing the camera, Walter Jr. praised Walter and called his father his idol. Hearing how his son saw him as a good father and thinking about the things he had kept from his family made Walter feel very uncomfortable. The next day, accompanied by his wife and son, Walter prepared to start his surgery. The doctor first administered general anesthesia, and under the effects of the anesthesia, Walter began to get a bit delusory, and it was at this time that Walter unintentionally made a fatal mistake.
Where's your phone? Your cell phone, did you bring it?
Which one?
This very phrase made the astute Skyler feel that something was off, but facing Walter, who was about to undergo surgery, Skyler found it inappropriate to continue questioning. Walter's surgery went very smoothly, and it wasn't long before Dr. Del Cavalli allowed him to be discharged. But Skyler was more concerned about whether Walter could now live independently. Walter had no idea that he was about to plunge into a family crisis. Back home, Walter saw his wife inexplicably packing her bags, saying she was taking the kids to her sister's for a couple of days, and she asked Walter to move out of the house during this time, leaving Walter completely baffled. It was not until Skyler mentioned the phrase Walter had said before his surgery.
Right before your surgery, I asked if you had packed your cell phone, and you said, which one?
Walter tried to excuse himself by saying he was in a comatose state at the time, but Skyler had investigated everything clearly, including from the start of Walter's disappearance. Skyler also knew that Walter had not accepted the financial help from the Gretchen couple. She thought the money for Walter's treatment was funded by Walter's mother, so she called her mother-in-law, only to find out she didn't even know her son had cancer. So where had Walter gone in the 4 days after she dropped him off at the airport? Skyler's barrage of questions caught Walter off guard, and he didn't know how to explain to his wife. Seeing Skyler determined to leave, Walter was ready to tell his wife the truth about everything, but Skyler didn't give him the chance.
Will you stay? Stay, and I will tell you everything.
Whatever it is, I'm afraid to know.
Abandoned, Walter sat alone in the backyard, lost in thought, when suddenly he heard a loud bang. It turned out that 2 planes had collided in the air, and the cause of the crash was due to Donald's operational error, but this was also related to Walter, because Jane's death had a direct connection to him. However, at this time, Walter still did not know he was intricately linked to this tragedy.